Hi everyone, it's Erin from the Provincial Farmhouse. Today I'm going to be creating a Christmas advent calendar. For my project today, I'm going to be using this $12 wooden advent calendar that I got from Kmart Australia. I really want to change the orientation of the drawers, and I'm going to be using transfers and molds and just giving this a really elegant makeover. First, I took out Paint Couture's Rapid Casting Resin. I'm going to be pouring out equal parts step 1 and step 2 into a silicone cup, and then I'm going to be stirring it really well for about 30 to 40 seconds. I am using Redesign's Regal Flourish mold today, and I wanted to create something that would go at the top of the tree, but that wasn't your sort of standard star, and I thought that this design here was beautiful and elegant, and I knew that resin would be the perfect choice. It would definitely be strong enough for what I wanted to do with it. I'm taking my casting out at about 10 minutes, and as you can see, it is still very flexible, and that's what I want because I want to be able to manipulate this. So I am going to cut off the beautiful scrolls on the sides, and then I'm going to just bend this into a shape that I like the look of up the top there, and then I'm going to use hot glue to hold those resin pieces in place. Now, as I said, I did take these out a bit early, so it is going to be really easy for the resin to hold its shape because it is still pretty fresh. I then went in and added some hot glue to that same design. I'm just adding a little hot glue dam so that I'm just going to be casting the beautiful scroll details. It took about 10 mil to do both of these, and I ended up casting, I think it was 6 pairs for my project. I do often prefer to use clay, but resin really is the choice for today's project because these pieces are going to be hanging over the edge of my project and they would just break off if I used clay. I set those pieces off to the side, and then I started looking at the drawers. Now I want to use a transfer, but I noticed that the drawers were sitting lower in their little cubbies than I wanted. So I'm going to be using these bits of paddle pop sticks or tongue depressors to prop that up. As you can see here, it is now level, and that's what I need to be able to put a transfer across the front of my advent calendar. I'm going to be attaching these little wood pieces with Gorilla Super Glue gel in the back of each of the drawers so that I can have them sitting nice and flush and even, and it'll be a lot easier to work with that surface. So I just went in and added 24 of those pieces of wood. You won't be able to see these pieces, so I wasn't worried about how they looked. I then took out Paint Couture's 2-in-1 primer in white. I'm going to be applying 2 coats of this over the top of each of these little drawers. I'm only going a little bit on the sides and a little bit on the top because I don't want to affect how these sit inside of the advent calendar. It is already quite a tight fit, and adding paint would just make it a lot harder for the drawers to go in and out. So I'm going to add the primer to those drawers, and then I went in and started adding it to the frame of the advent calendar. So I'm focusing again on the outside sections of each of those little cubbies. Again, any paint that I add to the inside could affect the function of the drawers. I also went on the outside of the advent calendar as well. As I was doing this, I decided I didn't like the gaps on the sides, so I decided to take out some more of those paddle pop sticks. I'm just going to draw a little line to tell me how to cut it, and then I'm going to be drawing some more lines so that I can fill in the gaps on the side. I just felt like it just didn't really look very tidy, and I wanted to make sure that it was all sort of filled up in the center, and then I would be framing it out. So I'm just making some little lines. I did use scissors to start off with, but as I did this, the wood split. So I learnt from this. I used this as a template. I traced it onto some more of these wooden sticks, and then from then on I used a craft knife to do my cutting, and I ended up thinking that the result was quite good. It was much better than using the scissors. I didn't get any splitting. So I'm just going to cut that to size. And then I used Gorilla Super Glue gel to glue each of these pieces in place. Once I had the wood glued down, I did then use a wet wipe to go in and tidy up any of the glue on the sides. I wasn't too worried about any smaller gaps that you might be able to see because I knew I was going to be adding transfers and obviously painting over it and having those resin castings. So the main goal was just to fill in those gaps so that it didn't detract from the rest of the design. I also decided to partially fill the top section because I knew that you'd be able to see a little bit of this even once I had that larger casting up the top. So I'm cutting that to size and then I'm going to glue that in place as well. The next day, I came in with some more of my 2-in-1 primer and I'm going over the top of each of those little wooden triangles that we added to fill in the gaps. So I did 2 coats of that and then let that dry completely. I then took out Paint Couture's Buttercream Chalk Paint. I am going to be adding this over the top of all of the areas where we have that white primer down, including the little drawer fronts as well. So I didn't film this whole process. I felt like it was quite repetitive, and I did stick with a pretty neutral color. I knew I was going to have a lot going on with the transfer and the castings, so I wanted to keep the front area pretty plain. When that buttercream was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Extreme Guard in Satin. I'm going to be sealing over everywhere that we have that buttercream down. I'm doing this for a few reasons. One, obviously it's going to protect my paint, but also I am going to be using transfers. And I find that Redesign transfers stick better to a dry sealed surface. So this just makes it a lot easier to use the transfers. So I'm going to be doing 1 coat over the top of each of those sections. And then when that was completely dry, I took out the Rosy Nest by Redesign. This is one of their newer MIDI transfers. And I'm going to begin adding this to the front. So I had some of this left over from some previous projects I did. I turned this transfer into an artwork on a canvas and I still have some pieces left. So I'm going to trim off that excess little leaf there and then I'm going to start rubbing. So obviously I have this over the top of those drawers. So I'm making sure that I'm going down into those gaps, making sure it's just really, really well stuck down because I do want it to be as sort of seamless as possible. I don't want those gaps to be super obvious. So I'm just going to go over the top of the whole thing. And then once I'm sure that that is completely stuck down, I then picked up part of, I'm just going to trim off that extra little bit there as you can see and save that. And then I'm going to be picking up part of the plastic and I'm going to be lifting that as I am rubbing, and I'm going really slow just to make sure that everything is down and secure. Once I was sure that everything was really well adhered, I went in with my craft knife and very carefully started making cuts in the gaps where each of the little drawers were. So I'm doing this really carefully, holding that drawer still while I'm making those cuts because I don't want to tear or break that transfer. I just want to make those little gaps so that our drawers can still go in and out. So I was definitely very careful during this process, making sure I had all of that cut properly. So I'm going to add another transfer on the left-hand side here and just repeat that same process. I felt that even though this isn't an obviously Christmas transfer, I felt like the colors still lent itself to Christmas, but it was sort of a more elegant color scheme, and obviously with the flowers and the birds, I love anything to do with flowers and birds, so it definitely tied in with my taste. Now if this wasn't to your taste, you could definitely do a lot of the same steps that I've done, but you could put a different transfer across the front of your advent calendar. But I just really love this one, and I love that I've been able to get 2 projects out of 1 MIDI transfer. I just went through, and as you can see, I'm just piecing together bits and pieces from this transfer. So I've just added this little branch hanging down from the first one that we added, going in and cutting anywhere that it overlaps with a draw edge. And then I'm going to be adding this sweet little bird. It's going to be perched on that branch there, and I am glad I was able to position it so that I didn't have to cut through the bird, and we could see that sweet little bird just on the front of the drawer. I added the leaves that we cut off from the bottom at the beginning, and then I added this sweet little bird perched on top of that. Again, maybe a bird wouldn't be on a leaf like this, but I just didn't want to have to cut through the bird. I thought that this still looked okay layout wise, so I'm just adding that one there, and then I'll gently go in and cut that out. In the bottom right hand section, I'm adding some more blue florals, and I really had to have a look at the layout of this and decide where I wanted things coming in. I had these leftover leaves here, so I'm going to have those peeking in from the top left. So when you're adding transfers, definitely keep in mind that you can have things creeping in from the sides. That's often a really great way to make your transfers go that little bit further, if you can sort of cut them in half almost and just use bits and pieces coming in from the edges. I'm also adding this larger floral up the top here. I just love this red. Again, the scale might be a little bit off on some of these florals, but overall I think that this layout works. I added some more leaf offcuts to the floral up the top, and then I had a look at another single flower that I had and decided that I would cut some of the elements from that one. So I've got a bud here with some leaves. I'm going to have that coming in from the right hand side. I also separated some other leaves from that same transfer design. I'm going to have that coming in a little bit further up the top. So I just tried to have elements coming in from all of the different sides of the advent calendar, just so that it would feel balanced. To seal my transfers, I'm using that same Extreme Guard in satin, and I'm being really careful as I'm applying this not to be having too much of that product on my brush. I don't want it seeping down the edges of the little boxes. They need to still be able to be opened. So I'm just going over the top. I just ended up doing one even coat over the top of this. And then I took out my pitch black chalk paint by Paint Couture. I am going to start adding that over the top of the resin castings that we did in the beginning. So this is the top piece. It's going to go at the top of the Advent Christmas tree. So I'm going to be adding an even coat of this black chalk paint. This is the undercoat. I'm going to be using a bronze metallic, and I really like to add a dark color underneath when I'm going for a bit more of a sort of darker, moody look. I'm also adding it to the scroll details, the partial castings that I did. Now, even if you don't have these exact molds, you can use similar molds to achieve a similar look. So any sort of scroll type castings could definitely work for a project like this. And you could definitely put a star at the top of the tree instead of what I'm going to do instead. When that was dry, I took out my bronze luxe metallic. I'm going to be dabbing this beautiful metallic over the top of the black paint on both the scroll details and the tree topper here. I don't need this to have full coverage. I'm happy for that black to peek through. It is giving us that rather moody vintage look. And I'm going to be repeating the same process over the top of all of those scroll pieces, adding that pitch black and then adding that bronze. And again, at this stage, you can definitely customize this and add whichever color best suits your home decor. When my pieces were completely dry, I took out my Gorilla Super Glue Gel again. I'm going to add glue directly to the advent calendar surface, and then I'm going to press my resin piece into my wet glue. I'm going to apply pressure until that is set. It usually takes about 30 to 60 seconds. And then I'm just going to continue to add my scroll pieces down the side. I did have my hot glue gun ready. Some of them had become a little bit warped, so I wanted to make sure that they were completely secure, and occasionally I did need a dab or two of that hot glue. So I have arranged my castings in a few different ways. It's a little bit hard to explain how I did it. I just sort of changed the orientation of some of them. I didn't want them all going the same way. And I also had to consider and make sure that each of these little drawers were going to open and that the castings wouldn't obstruct them in any way. So that definitely helped decide how I arranged my different pieces. Once I got to the bottom, I did glue another one of the castings. I've got that head glued off the edge. I glued another piece in, you'll see here, but I do end up changing my mind about that one that I just glued down. I do end up changing how I have the bottom looking. So I'm just going to add the other piece on the left. And then again, as I said, I am going to change the pieces that are either side of the more rectangular bottom. I'm going to be adding these sweet little jewelry box feet. I got these a little while ago. I think I got them from eBay. I'm going to be adding them with my Gorilla Super Glue Gel. I don't want to risk putting screws into this thin timber, and again, I don't want to obstruct the drawers. So I'm going to add glue to each of the 4 feet. And at this stage, I realized I didn't really like how those castings were looking. So I ended up cutting off part of it so that it would better fit that area. It's not going to obstruct the drawers opening. So I'm going to glue those 2 pieces in place. And I am going to save those extra little bits that I cut off though, because I'm going to use those in a different way. Once I had that other piece glued down, I grabbed the offcut, and here I'm just measuring how much room I have. I'm going to cut off the curl at the end of this one, and then after measuring, I realized I was going to have to cut a little bit off the top as well. So I'm going to cut that off, and I'm trying to think about the angle, how that meets the other casting that's already there. And then I'm going to glue that in place. I'm then going to repeat the same process for the other side. Next, I took out my Bronze Luxe Metallic again. I'm going to be going around that thin border around the edge, and I'm going to be adding the Bronze Luxe Metallic. So this is going to tie all of those pieces together. It's going to make the border look a bit more seamless. I'm just going around the outside edge. I'm also going to go a little bit over the top of the feet that we glued down the bottom, and I'm going to touch up any areas that maybe some of the bronze has rubbed off. Now I have sealed my paint obviously, so if I get bronze where I don't want it, I can wipe it back with a wet wipe and tidy that up. Next, I started adding pitch black chalk paint around the outside of the advent calendar. So I really wanted to bring in sort of more of like a block of color. Obviously, we've got a lot of colors going on the inside, and I felt like this was a really nice way to frame out the piece. So I'm going to be adding 2 coats of this around the outside. I'll also later be adding it to the back of the advent calendar as well. I am also adding it to the back of the resin castings as well. And then I went in with the bronze, as you can see here. I added some of it, and then I'm pulling it back. So I really do want it to be mainly black, but I did want to bring in some hints of that bronze. So I'm adding it, and then I am wiping it away. Next, I took out my Amazon stamps and a gold ink pad that I got from Officeworks Australia. I'm going to obviously start adding the numbers for the advent calendar. So I'm going to be starting with the number 1 up the top. I'm positioning the letters in the bottom right-hand corner. And if I make any mistakes, which did happen, I was able to wipe that back because our surface is sealed. And when I got to the double digit numbers, I obviously started with whatever number was on the far right. So if I'm doing the number 10, obviously I'd start with the 0 and then add the 1. And I just kept that in mind as I was adding my stamps as I was going. Now, if you don't have these stamps, you could definitely use a stencil instead. When I finished adding the numbers, I heat set the ink with my hairdryer on high for about 2 minutes. I then went in and sealed the numbers with a little bit more of that Extreme Guard in satin, just to protect the ink. I also sealed the sides that we painted in pitch black and bronze. When that was dry, I took out my light brown sugar antiquing glaze. I'm just lightly going in and brushing a little bit of this over the top. I like a vintage look. You could definitely leave this step out, but I find that this particular glaze gives my project a bit more of like a warm glow. And this is a Christmas project, and I felt like it tied in with the color scheme and the style of project that I was doing. When that was dry, it was time to add some little handles. So I'm adding a dab of Gorilla Super Glue Gel, and then I'm adding these little gold metal beads that I had in my stash. I thought that they were the perfect size. I also thought that they were looking a lot like maybe little Christmas ornaments. So I'm just adding that to each of the little drawers. The drawers are really light, so they definitely worked well as handles. Please excuse my head getting in the way every now and then. I definitely had to keep an eye on where I was positioning each of these little beads to get them as straight as possible. And here's a look at our finished Christmas Advent calendar. I love how this turned out. I set out to create a more elegant advent calendar, and I think that combining these molds and transfers has achieved that look. But let me know what you think of this in the comments. If you enjoyed today's video, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button, comment, and share it out. If you haven't already, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of our videos. You can find a full product list and my affiliate links in the description below. Thanks for watching.